Hi, folks. Get your pads and paper ready because we're going to be talking about some things most people don't know about communication in organizations. There is an appropriateness of communications, not only with content, but putting into context where the organization is in its lifespan. Few people are aware of this. Classically, there are 4 phases to the lifespan of an organization. You might have heard these before, and I'm going to go through them in much more detail. There's startup, growth, maturation, and decline. Decline of the organization leading to the death of it, to the reinventing of it, or to a merger and acquisition of it. Startup, growth, maturation, and decline. Each one of these 4 phases has its own unique emphases for leadership styles, for teamwork, for morale, for communication, for decision-making, and for planning. Part of this appropriateness is knowing in your communications, whether it's verbal, written, or electronic, who the receivers are and what the phase is of the organization. Let me just summarize these briefly for you, each of these 4 phases, and then I'll talk to you about the specific applications of those. Startup phase of an organization is an exciting time for an organization. There is an idea, there is a passion, there is a niche that one is trying to penetrate, and it is an exciting time. This brings together people who are innovative, sometimes very creative, and sometimes loose on following rules and regulations. But at this point in the lifespan of an organization, we need energy, we need creativity, we need off-the-wall thinking of that to see what we'll do. At this part of the lifespan of the organization, efficiency is very low. Profits are very low. The energy expended is very high, and the results are very low for those. And it is an exciting time. Sometimes over the period of months or years, the organization shifts into a growth phase. There is still a lot of energy being expended into it, and now they're starting to see some results of those. It's still an exciting time, and they're starting to find out what works for the organizations. So there is a little bit more of planning, where in the startup phase, we were just going with our gut. Let's see what happens and go from there. In a growth phase, we're starting to see what is working, and people start becoming even more excited. What starts to happen near the end of a growth phase of an organization, some of the characters, some of the big personalities that loved being with a startup of an organization start becoming disgruntled, because in a growth phase, there is starting to become more standardization. Here's what we need to do. Here is our customer base. Here's who we are serving. Here's what we need to develop. Here's what we need to communicate. And a lot of the very creative people find that this is not the organization for them. And there is a turnover of those creative people. Over the period of months and years, the organization goes into a maturation phase where there is the same amount of energy, but now there is greater and greater results, almost as if you start having results that you didn't earn. There is a lot of spin-off business. There is a lot of maximization of resources and people and products, for that matter. And what starts happening with the standardization, there is a formula. We know what works, and we need to abide by that formula. As such, the infrastructure of that organization starts expanding. There are more and more levels of management and administration. There are human resources departments. There are purchasing departments. There are different types of facilities on that. So the organization becomes much more complicated. Meetings abound during the maturation phase of an organization, that there are meetings not just for meeting's sake, but meetings to discuss things that never end up being acted upon. and people start becoming meetinged out, either at electronic meetings like this on Zoom or face-to-face meetings. There are a lot more policies and procedures and guidelines, each to ensure the protection of the organization, as well as to standardize what we're doing well. The organization at a maturation phase becomes a lot heavier. It becomes a lot more lugubrious, if you like that word, that it is slower to pivot. It is slower to change directions. It's slower to add things. And efficiency becomes key. Cost cuttings become key during this part. How can we maximize our profits during this time? Sometimes, despite themselves, organizations are very profitable and productive during a maturation phase. The fourth phase is the decline phase, leading either to the death of the organization. It runs its course. Especially in a community group or a nonprofit group, it serves all the people they needed to do. Or if it was a task organization, we've completed our tasks. And so it leads either to the death of the organization or to a merger or acquisition with another organization to reinvent it, or just to plain pure pivot and reinventing the organization, which starts the cycle all over again. These four phases: startup, growth, maturation, and decline. You can also put in the same words for sub features of the organizations. For example, you could have a mature phase of a startup organization, or you can have a decline phase of the maturation part of the organization. Each one of those four can be subcategories for the major categories as well, to really typify it. A good exercise to do in your organization, if you're a supervisor or a worker or a volunteer, is to survey people. Where are we in an organization in its lifespan? Startup, growth, maturation, and decline. Then ask them, using those four categories as subcategories, specify where we are within that. Are we in a startup phase? Are we in a growth startup phase? Are we a decline startup phase? The more specific you all can become, the more you can target decision-making, planning, and communications. Does that make sense? Part of this is the appropriateness of the communication. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through each one of those phases, the four phases, in a lot more specific detail. So you may want to write some notes down on this. Each one of these phases that I will talk about, I'm going to cover the categories of emphases, profits versus efforts, decision-making, planning, communication, teamwork, treats employees as, turnover rates, types of leaders needed at that point, and supervision. So here we go. The more specific we can become, the more we can tailor our decision-making, planning, problem-solving, and communication. The startup phase of an organization. The emphases are on survival. There is a high level of energy. There is a great deal of fun and satisfaction. And there is an acceptance and embracing of learning from mistakes. Hey, if we're not making mistakes, we're not doing things. That's that cutting edge. There is, in terms of profits versus efforts, there are huge efforts and very low profits, of course. The decision-making is very situational. Quite often it is quick, reactive, oftentimes relies on bottom-up input. The people who have to implement it, how are you going to do it? The planning is very little planning, much less let's make it through this month. Or there's some short-term planning. How can we penetrate this market in the next year? And there is more specific, targeted, tactical planning. The communication is informal and frequent. There's a lot of kicking around things as people huddle up, virtually or in person. There is sporadic communication. Sometimes people feel outside of the communication loop, which may cause some hard feelings. There is, especially with good leaders, a lot of listening going on. Teamwork, there are more groups to begin with, as opposed to teams, that they are naturally decided by necessity. And there is a lot of initiating things, a lot of useless time. There is very, very little emphasis on making groups teams at this phase. They treat employees as indispensable members, and the word family comes in. This is a family operation. This is a small operation. We're treat each other as family. The turnover is at this phase hardly any. The type of leaders are usually a charismatic person, a visionary person, a motivator, an energizer. And the specific supervising of work is close and regular contact. And most often the supervisors put out brush fires, things that were unplanned that are popping up. Those are the key elements of a startup phase of an organization. Okay, in the growth phase of an organization, the emphases are there is some kind of shared mission and from which people derive their senses of individual purpose. Here's what I do here. I do many things. There is a reduced frequency and patterns of mistakes. We've learned from our mistakes, so we don't repeat those mistakes. We may make some new ones, that's natural, but we learn from our mistakes. There's a phrase called we stick to the knitting. In a growth phase, we're starting to discover what is working, and we stick to that. Profits versus effort, still a lot of efforts, but increasingly more regular and predictable profits. The decision-making becomes less reactive, putting out brush fires, to more proactive. In that we start looking at decisions a couple steps ahead in terms of the implications of it. The planning is still short-term, but they are increasingly seeing the needs for some more long-term planning. There is a classic phrase in guerrilla warfare that fits into planning at this phase, and that is tactics dictate strategies. Tactics dictate strategies. That the tactics we're doing, we're starting to blend together to come up with an overall interwoven strategy. The communication increasingly becomes more formalized. There also starts evolving a grapevine or rumor mill during this phase. Some messages, regrettably, are still dropped between the cracks, not because of anybody holding things back consciously, but sometimes the lines of communication are not as solid as they used to be. Still at this phase, there's a lot of listening. How should we do things? The teamwork at this phase of the organization is that it becomes more vision and goal focused. Hey, we know who we are for the most part and where we're going now. And there are more defined units, whether it's a work unit or a department, where they're combining like specialists. From these defined units starts coming some initial responses of a team. At this phase, in the growth phase of an organization, you treat employees as value contributors of that. Turnover, some of the pioneers become bored and move on. Some of the people who came on and were promised things may feel betrayed and leave. There is, again, very little long-term thinking of career at this point. The types of leaders are usually transforming from the charismatic person, the energizer person, to more of a cheerleader of, hey, let's keep on doing things. Supervision is becoming more of an issue of a team builder, developing specialists and cross-training those and becoming the primary problem solvers. Okay, that is the growth phase of an organization. In the maturation phase of an organization, and this may be even years down the road, the emphases are on efficiency, less acceptance of mistakes. There are now more policies, procedures put in place and written down, and new formulas and systems. At that point, they may diversify in some new ventures, which is nice. But there's more guidelines which are verbalized or written down. The profits and effort, they are equal, turning into proportionally greater profits for less and less efforts. The decision-making starts to become slow. You send things to committee. There's increased layers or levels for approval. They still embrace bottom-up suggestions, but there's more top-down decision-making being made. The planning is looking at longer-term cycles. The planning also includes some action steps where early on we just winged it and say what worked. There's more and more action steps. This is a phase where we turn around the tactics dictate strategies from the growth phase to just the opposite. Our overall strategies are dictating the tactics. Our big picture emphases are dictating what we do in specific situations. Increasingly, in a mature organization, there becomes a bureaucracy that sometimes inhibits necessary changes. Communication is more defined, both vertical, top-down, bottom-up, as well as horizontal between specializations or departments or shifts. There's increasing amount of irrelevant information and becomes a greater ongoing systematic problem that communication gets dropped, becomes lost, and people start identifying communication or lack thereof as a problem. Teamwork is more leader-directed. There's more special project teams. There are multiple levels. There are some competition between teams at this point, sometimes for the good, mostly for the bad. There evolves some morale problems at this point, and there's a blending which could cause conflict between some specialists and generalists. There is some alienating between top levels of management or administration and the worker, what they're called the worker bees. They treat employees as resources, and sometimes, especially in a mature phase of an organization, their employees are taken for granted. The turnover, hopefully good organizations at this point still promote from within, but that becomes an issue that some organizations that keep on bringing outsiders in, some of the internal people will leave saying there's no opportunity for me here. There is initially some plans in the mature phase of an organization, some succession planning, especially with key people. Who's going to replace me when I retire? What happens if I become ill and can't come back? What if I'm on maternity leave for 6 months? Now, so there's more of an emphasis on succession planning, and as such, there's starting to involve more cross-training of people. Types of leaders usually are efficient managers. They manage things and processes. At some time, they also bring in some professional coaches to help out the managers become better leaders and the leaders to become better managers. The supervision, there's a notion at this point called a chain of command, where we have to have things approved through different levels, which again inhibits the decision-making. The supervision, good supervisors at this point still develop people. They want to develop people who have a place in the organization for a while, even if they leave your crew, your specialization. The supervisor takes pride in being a good delegator and learns how to hold people accountable for their actions. At that time, they also learn how to handle difficult types of people and situations. Much more complex during this phase. In the decline phase of an organization, leading to the death of the organization or the reinventing of it, the emphases are on survival, on restructuring, being open to acquiring or merging or being acquired or being merged with. There are some people who start to thrive during these scary times where they re-engineer what they're doing. products or services or processes. They want to even reinvent the organization, not just with a new brand or a new name for the organization. Along the way, there is an increasing edge again that our survival depends on this. Profits versus effort, crazy. At this point, there are usually big profits despite increasingly disjointed efforts. You're successful despite what you're doing. The decision-making at this point are exclusively top-down, that the big bosses do not have time nor the inclination to talk to the people who have to implement those. Once the decisions are made, they're very quickly acting. So there are similar decisions made that from early on, but with a different edge on it. The planning is short-term. How can we survive? As such, there's a lot of tactical. What should we do now to pivot? Sometimes if someone has some perspectives, they start exploring new options in the planning. We've been doing it this way forever. Are there any other ways? Or a competitor has changed their planning to this. What parts of that might work for us? The communication at this phase, in the decline phase of the organization, tends to be more and more disjointed, where it's constricted and restricted. There's more blaming going on. Hey, I didn't know there was a meeting. There's more of an entrenched rumor mill or grapevine. If people are not receiving direct communication, official communication, they're going to make up their own so that they have some sense of comfort. So the grapevine becomes well established. Teamwork is a challenge to teamwork at this point. There's more panicking. There's more morale problems and issues. There is some banding together for a team. Hey, it's us against the world. It's us against the competitors. We're in charge of the future of this organization. Let's band together. So there's a double edge of that, of more panicking, but also it's us against the world mentality. Increasingly, in a decline phase, the organization treats employees as burdens, as cumbersome, as interruptions in the important things supposedly that we're doing. Turnovers, there are reductions and layoffs. There may be consolidations of departments and therefore teams, and eliminating duplicate type positions. At that point, they may bring in a lot more consultants. They may be bringing in some people in a short-term project or people doing a short-term gig. Some workers at this phase are also jumping ship, that they know that the writing's on the wall, and if they're looking at their futures and their career futures, they jump ship. The type of leaders at this phase are usually micromanagers who are real good at the details, but don't have a big picture view. They're treading water with the rest of them. There may be sometimes at this point an emergence of some new kinds of visionaries who have the bigger type perspectives and experiences to say, this is a hidden opportunity for us. And finally, good supervisors at this point protects people and is the official or unofficial information source. These four phases, the startup, growth, maturation, and decline, you can see each has their own emphases in all of those factors. My bottom line here is a thing called systems theory. Systems theory has been used in biology, in family therapy, in management science. And systems theory essentially means that for every change, every implementation, there are ripple effects to greater or lesser degrees within the organization, that we're all dependent on one another to greater or lesser degrees. Optimally, we would love to be interdependent in our organizations, that we are independent in what we do, but we're dependent on others, leading it to a whole new level of being interdependent. Systems means that there are always changes. Nothing is ever done in isolation. There are always effects to actions, either immediate or long-term. And people who have this broader view of any kind of an organization, from a nonprofit organization to a sports team to a business, views it as a dynamic system that always has ripple effects. Given all of what I say, you can now understand what I'm saying about appropriate communication. You have to understand where the organization is in its lifespan and tailor your electronic communication, your written communication, your verbal communication, either immediate or online communication, in perspective to where the organization is. This is the appropriateness of communications. In terms of choices, that will be our subject for the next lecturette on decision making. Thank you.